Blue water drum man Indigenous cause. Steve Indigenous cause. Gagwe, Quake, Amino Jibing, and Treaty 2 in Juruá. Mashkure Bishike Dudum. I'm a product of colonization, and I'm a 60s scoop survivor. And so I walk between two worlds. My ceremonial space as a cultural leader and a Sundance chief, and my professional space as a cartographer, entrepreneur, and business leader. I'm going to be talking about Indigenous mapping. And so I appreciate you listening, and I just wanted to say happy DIS Day. And oh, by the way, and thank you to the organizers of this event for inviting me to speak today. I have a lot of information that I'm going to be going through, so please buckle up and enjoy the ride. I like to start with this idea around land acknowledgements, and it's become a thing in Canada where we're acknowledging Indigenous peoples. According to the Department of Historic Resources for the Commonwealth of Virginia, the Department of Historic Resources, the Board of Historic Resources, and the State Review Board acknowledged the Indigenous peoples of Virginia and expressed its gratitude for the continued stewardship of her lands and waterways over many generations. Later it says, we commit to ourselves to meaningful engagement with all Virginians, past and present, as we strive to fulfill our charge as stewards of Virginia's long history and rich history. Which is what the Department of Historic Resources says. According to the Virginia Museum of Arts, the Commonwealth of Virginia was one of the first points of contact between Indigenous peoples and European settlers. The Virginia Museum of Fine Arts acknowledges the presence of the Powhatan chiefdom and the Monacan Nation as on the land in which the museum now stands, and honors all Indigenous peoples of Virginia, past and present. Today, Virginia is home to 7 federally recognized tribes: Chickahominy Indian Tribe, Chickahominy Indian Tribe Eastern Division, Monacan Indian Nation, Nansemond Indian Tribe, Pamunkey Indian Tribe, Rappahannock Tribe, and the Upper Mattapony Indian Tribe. In addition to these federally recognized tribes, the Commonwealth of Virginia also recognizes the Cheronaca, sorry if I'm ruining this, or the Nottoway Indian Tribe, the Mattapony Indian Tribe, the Nottoway Indian Tribe of Virginia, and the Potawatomi Indian Tribe of Virginia. These 11 tribes represent 3 linguistic groups in Virginia: Algonquin, Siouan, and Iroquoian. While land acknowledgements show a recognition of and respect for Indigenous peoples, they also oversimplify complex histories of Indigenous peoples and fail to recognize the ongoing impacts of colonization that continue today. So I have, and it's more relevant in Canada, but I have, in addition to doing land acknowledgements, considered taking the following 6 actions to cultivate strong relationships with Indigenous peoples. Number 1, give lands back to Indigenous peoples. Number 2, in 1982, the Working Group on Indigenous Populations was established by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. Jose R. Martinez Coco led a study about the systematic discrimination of Indigenous peoples worldwide. From this study, the working group began to draft a declaration on Indigenous rights in 1985 based on consultations with Indigenous representatives from around the globe. The working group submitted their first draft in 1994, and with the formation of the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2006, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted in 2007. UNDRIP deals with a wide spectrum of Indigenous rights and contains 46 articles of a standard of achievement to be pursued. I call on you to work towards implementing those 46 articles of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. 3, in the summer of 1990, a 78-day standoff known as the Oka Crisis occurred between Kanesatake protesters, Quebec police, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Canadian Army. As a result, the federal government established the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1991. Extensive research and community consultations focused on historical and contemporary relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, and had 4 themes: governance, land and economy, social and cultural issues, and the North. The resulting 5-volume report was released in 1996 and concluded the need for a complete restructuring of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, and contained 440 recommendations for how to do so. I call on you to work towards implementing the 440 recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. 4. In 2007, the Indian Residential School Settlement Act, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, was finalized. One of the elements of the agreement was to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada to help foster reconciliation among students, their families, their communities, and all of Canada. From 2007 to 2015, the TRC documented experiences from over 6,500 witnesses. The findings from this effort formed a multi-volume report which included 94 calls to action or recommendations for further reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. I call on you to work towards implementing those 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. 5. In 2004, Amnesty International released a report called Stolen Sisters, a human rights response to discrimination and violence against Indigenous women in Canada, due to the appalling number of Indigenous women who are victims of racialized, sexualized violence. The Native Women's Association of Canada carried out research and provided awareness about violence against Indigenous women and launched the Sisters in Spirit initiative. From their research, they developed a national database to track cases of violence against Indigenous women and released a report entitled What Their Stories Tell Us. Research findings from the Sisters in Spirit initiative. The Legal Strategy Coalition on Violence Against Indigenous Women was formed in 2014, and they released a report with over 700 recommendations and calls to action. In 2014, the same year, the Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police also released Missing and Murdered Aboriginal Women, a national operational overview, which documented 1,181 people's experiences from 1980 to 2012, and they later added an additional 11 Indigenous women who were missing. In 2015, the Government of Canada launched a national public inquiry, and in 2019, the inquiry's final report titled Reclaiming Power in Place was released. More than 2,380 people participated in the national inquiry, including testimonies, public hearings, and evidence gathering efforts. And the report contains 231 individual legal imperatives or calls for justice for Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual people. I call on you to work towards implementing the 231 calls to action from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. And 6, invest in and support Indigenous economies. This requires corporate Canada and the US to adjust their supply chains and develop Indigenous procurement strategies. It also requires financial institutions to reduce barriers for accessing financing. Capacity building with Indigenous peoples will promote strong investment and equity opportunities, as well as strong economic relationships. So with that, I say go do the work. So in 2010, I co-founded the Firelight Group. We're a research consulting company with a bunch of colleagues and friends. And we wanted to be consulting in a very different way, where the nations that we work for drive the process. Much of our work is designed to create and enhance community capacity while producing high-quality research products that support their Indigenous rights, titles, and interests. Firelight provides a suite of services to Indigenous communities in many areas of work. We support communities across Canada and the US in Indigenous knowledge and land use studies, in ecology, mapping, environmental assessment, planning, health, and socioeconomic work. We feel honored to work with knowledge holders, Indigenous elders, and community experts to assist them with their projects, and are proud to influence change in a positive way for their communities. Firelight has become the leader in Indigenous-led studies. Our approach is a very unique approach in that we focus on things that matter most to Indigenous nations we're working for. The nations decide the research agenda, and our job is to support them to carry this out. And we design every project with the intent of building or enhancing skills at the community level, so that they may be able to carry this work on in the future. So I love maps, and since it's GIS Day, I want to talk about the power of maps. And maps have historically been used as a communication tool, but the underlying notion of a map is the exertion of power and knowledge. Those that hold the pen wield the power to define place and space. By consciously excluding Indigenous peoples from the map, it reinforced the idea that no one was here and that it could be colonized by foreign interests. Indigenous peoples have been able to use maps to decolonize. And while decolonizing the map, Indigenous peoples are now also indigenizing the map. I think I have an indigenizing, look, this is my laptop, someone else's laptop. Indigenous peoples are also indigenizing the map. So as a cartographer, I've worked to support Indigenous peoples to communicate and assert their rights and interests through maps. And in a past lifetime, I was a carpenter, like a cabinet maker, and I've learned to use a variety of tools to create those pieces of work. So, for example, I might use a hammer to hammer a nail, or I'd use a saw to cut a piece of wood. And you probably use a hammer to cut the wood if you hit it hard enough, but I would likely use the saw to cut it because it gives you that nice clean cut and that's a straight edge. Well, mapping is very similar to that, and there are multiple ways to tell a story through a map. Understanding your audience will determine how to apply these elements in storytelling. The role of the cartographer is to translate data, analysis, and outputs in a way that is inclusive and that everybody can understand. This is the map of New France by Alexander Juruá from 1685. And by consciously excluding Indigenous peoples from this map, it reinforced that idea that it could be colonized by their interests. So in this example, maps were used to assert power over large tracts of land. It's important to note that although the physicality of the landscape remains relatively constant, the templates of boundaries and names do not. So in Canada, you know what I say, even the United States for that matter, it would look a lot different in the eyes of British and European colonizers. These maps never took into account that there were people here who lived on these lands long before Europeans arrived, who had place names, sovereignty, governance, jurisdictions of family territories, sacred places, and common travel routes. Now, this map is interesting. It was produced by Andrew DeRoy in 1777, or actually, it's 1763 there. It was prepared after the French and Indian War, and it shows some of the Indigenous groups, especially in the South and West Appalachian region here. But we can see that some of these places are being renamed and restored by colonizers. European settlers were challenged with understanding Indigenous nations and their languages. These descriptions of how Indigenous groups spoke don't go further into the why their perspectives of place and space are important. By being ignorant to the long-standing Indigenous relationship to place and space, large swaths of territory were renamed and restored. What I want to do is brief introduction to Indigenous peoples in Canada. So we had a treaty-making process between the Crown, the King and Queen of England, and Indigenous peoples from 1725 to 1923. This includes the peace treaties, the peace and friendship treaties, the Upper Canada land surrenders, the Robinson treaties in the purple here, the Douglas treaties on the west coast, and the numbered treaties, like these ones up here, and the Williams treaties. And actually, I've got a medallion. It's the boundary of Treaty 2 territory where I'm from, which is that region right there. You can see where Treaty 2 is. And so my dad's nation is this bead right here, and my mom's nation is that bead right there. And so I come from the heart of Treaty 2. What I find interesting about this map is that it's titled Historic Treaties, as though those are relics of the past. Things that don't need to be, that we don't need to deal with anymore. Whereas Indigenous people are constantly having to defend and affirm their treaty rights on a daily basis. By the way, I've gone through an exercise of mapping these boundaries, and they're based on cartographic representations rather than meets and bounds. So these are actually incorrect boundaries. And what's interesting is about this boundary, treaty number 4, is that because they're cartographic representation and they negotiated the treaty, they're actually incorrect. They put the places in the wrong place, and now you'll never get a nice smooth line like that. It's actually like a figure-8 line. Since the establishment of the treaties, Indigenous peoples have fought to have their rights recognized by Canada. This map illustrates the boundaries of signed comprehensive land claims and self-government agreements between First Nations and the Canadian governments. These agreements have been ratified and brought into effect since the announcement of the Government of Canada's Comprehensive Land Claims Policy in 1973 and the establishment of the BC Treaty process in 1992. The Canadian government established the Indian Act 1876, and it's still present to this day. And these are just some examples of what are in that act. The Indian Act is used to control most aspects of Indigenous people's lives. It focused on 3 main areas: band councils, reserves, and membership. And its primary purpose is to control Indigenous peoples and assimilate them into Canada. What's interesting about this photo here is that it's a permission slip that was issued by the Deputy Superintendent for a First Nation person to leave the reserve. If you've ever heard that term, that person's off the reservation, it actually comes from this negative connotation. If they did not have this note in their possession, they could be arrested, fined, and thrown in jail. In 1930, the federal government devolved control over Crown lands and natural resources to the provincial governments through the Natural Resources Transfer Act in 1930. The First Nations and lands reserved for Indigenous peoples, as well as national parks, were excluded from the Act. This raised major issues for the continuance of Indigenous people's access to wild foods, subsistence activities, economic development, and other rights-based activities. Today, this is where we are. You can see we're distributed across Canada. In 2017, Firelight worked with Google to put Indigenous communities on Google's base maps. The yellow stars represent First Nations. The green circles represent Inuit communities. The red squares represent Métis. The purple stars represent non-federally recognized First Nations, and the blue balloons represent tribal councils. For the past 2 years, Firelight has also been working with Apple Maps to ensure Indigenous lands are represented on their platforms. In addition to having lands represented, Indigenous place names are being added to the map, as well as the pronunciations being supported by Siri. So how do we apply maps in an Indigenous people's context? Well, we need to take a rights-based approach. So what does that mean? Well, the Constitution Act, basically the act that created Canada as an independent sovereign nation from the British Crown, this is a relatively new act. It was actually created within my lifetime in 1982. Indigenous leaders before us fought to ensure that our rights were acknowledged and protected under Section 35 of that act. And for them, I'm grateful for this work. But today, it's important to understand your rights and how to apply them in a modern context. In our work with Indigenous peoples, we must take a rights-based approach, one that develops an understanding of Indigenous rights, title, and interests, of jurisdiction, and of legal precedents. Now, please know, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a cartographer, but these are just a few cases that illustrate the importance of consultation and accommodation for Indigenous nations. The burden of proving Indigenous rights is on the Indigenous nations themselves. Indigenous groups keep fighting the Canadian government to ensure that those rights are acknowledged and enforced. And case law is constantly defining the Indigenous-Crown relationship. But what these cases have demonstrated is that the government has a fiduciary responsibility and duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples. So from an Indigenous people's perspective, there's a lot of pressure for a wide variety of resource development activities to occur in our territories. For conservationists, the idea to protect the land from resource development also has implications on Indigenous people's interests. For example, some nations want to see development take place in a sustainable manner that provides opportunities for wealth creation for their members. There are so many interests in the landscape that need to be taken into consideration, but Indigenous people's rights, title, and interests are often seen as an afterthought. We certainly don't want to develop the land to the point where our rights are being negatively affected. This is LNG developments up in northern British Columbia. So when you think of clean energy, when you get told the term clean energy, this is what it looks like for us on our landscapes. For many nations like the Silk Routine, we've had to rely on the courts to affirm Indigenous title, not just Indigenous rights. In order to do this, tailored research to demonstrate ongoing occupation of territories required. According to the Supreme Court decision laid out by Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, occupation must be continuous, sufficient, and exclusive. But for the Blueberry First Nations, this is their territory, up in northeastern British Columbia, the pace of and extent of resource development in their territory is affecting their Treaty 8 rights. This case is significant because it meant that the province of British Columbia could not take up lands to an extent that infringes their treaty rights, but rather the Crown, in this case, the province acting on behalf of the Crown, must act with diligence and integrity to implement, uphold, and protect the purpose and promise of Treaty 8. When you have development like this, which we mapped out with Blueberry, where can they exert their treaty rights? On the international stage, Indigenous peoples worldwide have been advocating for the recognition of their rights, title, and interests. And please note that the adoption of UNDRIP constitutes the minimum standards of requirement for survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples of the world. That's just the minimum what's been laid out in the UNDRIP. There are numerous articles within UNDRIP that address Indigenous people's rights. You can see there's 46 articles. But more importantly, there's a recognition that institutions must obtain free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous peoples for activities that may affect their lands, territories, or other resources. So what is AFPIC? Well, AFPIC deals with providing adequate information to all participants in advance of any engagement to ensure that they are informed for how the research results will be used. Efforts need to be taken toward gaining consent from knowledge holders without coercion. So in line with previous court cases that dealt with consultation and accommodation, UNDRIP identifies a path towards earning consent from Indigenous peoples. So what is consent? Well, if we think of it in this manner, this might help. AFPIC allows Indigenous peoples to give or withhold consent without coercion. It also enables Indigenous peoples to conduct their own independent discussions and decision-making. And these are some of the ways that AFPIC can be applied in community-led processes. Introduce and explain what your project is about. Think about the who, what, where, when, why, and how your project is going to be used. Enforce confidentiality and usage protocols for outputs. Plan for data management from the beginning. And back up and secure your data. Another principle that coincides with AFPIC is the notion of OCAP, or ownership, control, access, and possession. OCAP was designed by the First Nations Governance Center with the intent to provide Indigenous data governance principles. Any information created about Indigenous peoples should reflect on this principle. And some good examples of research methods include the following resources. I encourage you to seek these and other methods as you pursue your research. I'd like to give you an example of how we indigenize the map. What does that mean, indigenizing the map? Indigenous mapping is where the community drives the process, decides what to map or not to map. Maps are not new to Indigenous peoples, as we heard earlier on today, and have been used for generations to share our stories and assert Indigenous rights. One of the earliest examples of maps that our ancestors used are the stars. By knowing the placement of the stars, our ancestors could navigate locations on the land and on the water. In some communities, this star knowledge has been passed down through generations and continues to be used today. The outcome of an effective community-led engagement process looks something like this. The nation can go through the process of restoring place and space. This can be an important healing exercise that positions the nation's interests in the forefront. It changes the narrative from go elsewhere to identifying preferred areas. And working with Indigenous peoples around the world, we've developed and refined the direct digital mapping method, or D2D mapping. This was in response to shortened timelines for us as Indigenous peoples to respond to major development applications in our territories. We had to be innovative and adapt technologies to suit our needs. We use Google Earth as our base map. In a digital environment, the map can be zoomed in and panned around to enable us to find where we are on the land. Natural features are very apparent, such as individual trees, sandy areas versus grassy areas. And the map can also be tilted into a three-dimensional view, and we can add our map features right on top of that imagery. Data can be organized and Google Earth using folders and subfolders, and the coding system is used within the name field, and notes about the site are in the description field. So there's the name field and the description field. Typically, Indigenous knowledge and land use studies involve these activities to engage members from the community. We have a number of touch points where we're in the community working with people. The goal is to create a positive research environment that is driven by the community to achieve their goals and aspirations. Before carrying out your engagement efforts, it's important to incorporate these considerations. Language, ensuring that everyone understands what you're actually talking about. We hear this saying here in Canada, like, just speak plain English. Participatory, ensuring that community champions are actively involved in the collective decision-making processes. Encourage consensus-based decision-making processes where everyone's voice counts. Inclusive, taking into account that people each have a role to play, and they may prefer to participate in different ways, such as one-on-one interviews, in group settings, versus speaking publicly in a community-wide workshop. Aim to reach as many people as possible, from elders to youth, men and women. It should be designed in collaboration with community-based champions so that cultural protocols and practices are respected and honored in the process. It should be verification focused, meaning that you're bringing the result back to the community to ensure that your interpretation of their knowledge is correct. It also provides an opportunity to course correct and get it right. Be transparent with your ongoing communication, with regular check-ins and development of a report back summary of engagement results in an easy to read format. Be community-based and community-driven, recognizing that each community is different and has their own unique needs, and not taking a one-size-fits-all approach. And finally, be innovative, meaning to be constantly on the lookout for new methods and tools that enable community members to participate in community-driven processes. In a typical research process, we'll talk to as many people as possible. This represents each of those people that we'll talk to gain a deeper understanding of their connection in place. We'll record the interviews with audio and video recorders and document on maps where these places are located. Each person comes to the table with their own set of knowledge and experience, and our job is to ensure that we honor it by treating it carefully and recording it honestly. It's important to note that although we're only able to collect a small sliver of someone's life, these values represent anchor points to a much broader set of land use values and experiences. When each person's data are brought together, we start to realize a broad community of practice that includes values such as hunting, fishing, plant and berry picking, habitation sites, cultural sites, places that matter most. Each interview produces two distinct outputs: a quantitative site-specific data set and a qualitative rich set of narratives. With the map data, we will often generate and buffer the data for public consumption. That's what you see on this map. These are buffered values and generalized values. While also maintaining the raw points, lines, and polygons for internal consumption. We'll also transcribe the audio files and analyze them into themes. It's through this analysis that we can incorporate the narratives and testimonies of individuals while also honoring what was said. At the bare minimum, each value should contain the who, what, where, when, as shown on the left side. We call these data diamonds. They've been called data diamonds in this type of research. It is through the thousands of interviews that we've completed with that we realize that we need to advance Indigenous data quality metrics. We've come up with a new standard for data quality, which in our epistemology we would call data stars. In addition to data diamonds, we're also ensuring that we're documenting the ecological value of the site, the kinship relationship associated with the value, the Indigenous knowledge transfer that occurs by participating in the activity, and the relational aspect of each site to other sites. So how can Indigenous people learn more about mapping and GIS technologies? Well, for far too long, Indigenous peoples have been excluded from the map. We're changing that. Mapping is a form of storytelling, and how we tell our stories relies on data, analysis, and presentation. Our culture guides our approach to storytelling, and it's important to note that what tools and data we need to synthesize. Indigenous mapping requires that we need to use a variety of tools to achieve our map. So we beg, we borrow, we steal tools to support our mapping process. And this may involve using open source tools, or it might involve using proprietary mapping softwares for presentation and results. And maps, like I said earlier, are not new to Indigenous peoples and have been used for generations to share our stories and assert our rights. Indigenous maps allow Indigenous peoples to share their stories and protect the rights of their homelands by identifying what matters most. Indigenous mapping occurs when the Indigenous people are in the driver's seat leading the data collection process. And there are many ways in which Indigenous mapping data can be collected. And there are many tools that can be used to do this data collection. Often the best source of information is from the people who know these places and have been taught from generation to generation. And not all data can be shared publicly, but so it's important as Indigenous peoples to acknowledge and celebrate that knowledge and stories can be represented through maps. So the Indigenous Mapping Workshop is an Indigenous-led event focused on building a global community of Indigenous mappers. We create safe spaces for Indigenous people to talk and share their stories, increase their spatial literacy, expose them to the wide variety of technologies and techniques, and advance Indigenous pedagogies of mapping and research methodologies. And since 2014, we've hosted 14 events around the globe. We've also supported our Indigenous partners in Juruá with 2 events and held 3 events in Australia to help launch the Indigenous Mapping Workshop Australia. We just had our 3rd Australian event in April of this year. And we've shifted from an annual event, an annual workshop, to an online virtual space that houses the largest global network of Indigenous mappers. It's free for all Indigenous peoples, and we have a variety of rates for non-Indigenous members. A virtual platform that allows Indigenous peoples to connect with each other will give them premier access to mapping resources. So for the first time ever, mappers can revisit all of the Indigenous mapping content at their own pace. So we have all of our training materials, we have our content, over 100 hours of content, we have over 2,000 members on the collective, and over 40 member mapping trainers that are part of this collective. And through the collective, we offer monthly speaker series that's where we can share content such as podcasts and discussions, and job postings, and funding sources. So we're proud of the global network of Indigenous mappers we've created. We're currently planning 3 events to take place in 2024. One in Aotearoa, one in Australia, and one here on Turtle Island. So to learn more, I encourage you to go visit indigenousmaps.com. So with that, I want to say thank you for listening. You've been a great crowd. And I say thank you very much for your honor.
So this is the Transboundary Commission of the Juruá, Yurúa, Ammonia, Altamaya rivers, represented here by these excellent people. We're going to be talking about mapping a path to justice in a climate crisis, and we're going to have 3 main points. And we're going to start with 3 cases of mapping justice in Soweto, mapping arteries of deforestation in the Amazon, mapping climate and forest change for communities. The presentation, the words are going to be in English. They're going to be speaking. I'm going to be translating. We're all going to be learning. Can we all nod our heads? Yes. Okay. We can do it. We can do it. I would also like to point out that one of the people here is actually present in this photograph, which is the first time I met him, and that's Andres Arevalo Perez. Andres, that's him standing with his older sister on top of those logs in 2004. He has grown. And that's him holding that rifle on the left. And you'll note how he holds that. That'll be important later. Okay, Andrés, ¿quieres venir aquí con quién te va a apoyar? ¿Solo? Sí. So Andrés is going to talk about his community, and I will do my best to translate and keep it moving. Andrés.
Buenos días.
Good morning.
Buenos días con todo. Mi nombre es Andrés Arevalo Pérez, soy de la comunidad nativa de Soweto, por parte de Perú. Voy a explicar sobre el caso del señor Bichota, como le ven en la imagen, está con su hijo. Él ha sido líder de lo que fue asesinado en 2013. 12 por defender su territorio.
He was assassinated in 2014 defending his territory.
Y acá hay algo muy importante que el señor Bichota, el líder de la comunidad nativa de Soweto, donde que indica donde que están los taladores.
It's important to realize that Bichota, the leader of Soweto, indicates using this map where the loggers.
Donde que están los puntos rojos.
You can see the red points.
Son taladores donde que.
Loggers who.
Donde que están los puntos rojos, territorio de la comunidad nativa de Soweto, donde que ellos han luchado con los madereros ilegales.
Invaded and fighting illegal loggers who have invaded their territory.
Y acá hay un caso, el caso actual, lo que está pasando en la comunidad nativa Alto Tamay de Soweto, el caso del Poder Judicial. ¿Sí?
The case of Alto Tamay de Soweto is actually happening right now as we speak.
Y han pasado 9 años, el juicio va a quedar de nuevo en cero, de nuevo estamos poniendo alerta sobre el caso de los líderes Achánica, lo que fue asesinado en 2012 en la comunidad nativa Alto Tamay de Soweto.
Putting on alert that after 9 years, this case has reached 0, and it's still moving forward, and that these people were killed in September of 2014. Yeah. Y ahora vamos a hablar de mapeo.
Ya, acá voy a explicar un poco cómo ha sido la comunidad, cómo está ubicado
I'm going to help you real quickly talk about where the community is and how it works.
La comunidad de Sahueto, hay puntos lo que está ubicado, son casas,
You can see the points are houses,
cementerio
cemeteries,
y más viviendas de la comunidad, los comuneros.
and old house sites of the communities. This map and others like it were important to establish the presence, me talking, of the indigenous people of Soweto that allowed them to argue for their rights to territory and occupation of territorial control.
Y acá hay un importante que voy a explicar anteriormente, que por parte de la tecnología nos ayuda bastante ubicar de dónde a dónde pertenecemos nuestro territorio por parte de la comunidad de Sahueto.
And I want to tell you real quickly that the technology was very important for us to understand where our territory was and how to articulate that and share it with others.
De hecho, análisis también sobre de concepción está conforta, conforta varios calán
So,
y cruzar.
so our territory was also overlapped with 3 forestry concessions, Ecocusac, Ecoforta, and Barrios Calvan, which created great conflict. And you can see here, this is me speaking again, as you can see from the map, you can see that the squares are logging camps, current and older, as well as the points are points of extraction of high-value timber species. And you can see that these points were registered mostly by the indigenous themselves, Edwin Chota in particular, and his lieutenant Jorge Rios, but also others such as Victor, who is his cousin, who was trained in GPS technology as well.
Yeah. Al respecto de nosotros como comunidad Sahueto, nos ayuda bastante en los mapeos. Gracias los operantes de nosotros nos ayuda bastante para poder ubicarnos de dónde a dónde. Por ejemplo, voy a explicar un poco sobre la carretera ilegal que nos trae muchas amenazas.
These maps were very useful for us to show us where we were and where we were in relation to other things. For example, we'll be talking about this road, which brings a lot of threats to us. Eso es lo más importante. Osifor
llegó a la comunidad nativa Totamá de Sahueto para hacer un diagnóstico
The Osifor, the Office for Forestry Inspection, finally came, the last step in titling was for them to come and record that there was illegal logging or not, and that would determine whether or not they finally had control of their lands.
Y a donde que los concesionarios que mencionaron anterior en la exposición, donde que nuestros líderes que fue asesinado por parte de el señor lo que ves cargando su retrocarga, escopeta, es mi papá, mi persona, es mi padre.
And carrying the shotgun there is my father. He's carrying just like his son.
Y él es un líder de la comunidad Sahueto, ha luchado por su territorio también.
He is another leader of the community who also fought for the rights of the community. He was sub-chief when I first went to Soweto. That's me speaking.
Donde que los concesionarios echaban la culpa a mi padre, que mi padre talaba madera, el concesionario no.
So the concessionaires wanted to put all these logging sites, the guilt, onto this man, his father, Kishiro's shoulders, so that they would not be responsible and they could maintain control of their forest concessions. Edwin Chota, who was present, refused to sign off on that, despite immediately being put under another death threat. that if you sign here, if you don't sign here, you die. Yeah, the next day, Edwin and his second, knowing that their lives were in more danger than they ever had been, moved as fast as they could to the community of Evito, where their Brazilian cousins and allies awaited them, and halfway there they were ambushed and killed.
Los líderes de la comunidad de Soweto no solo también han luchado por su defender su territorio, también por parte de carretera, donde que él viajó por 2 meses por Nueva Italia, ve la situación de la carretera de los marineros ilegales.
Many people don't know this, but Edwin Shota, before 7 years before he was assassinated, was also actively working to stop the road, this logging road, which served as the eventual southern border of his territory. And this is a picture of him at the front side of the Nueva Italia Puerto Breu road, which we'll be talking about next. Thank you, Andres.
Gracias.
María Elena y Alfonso, ¿quieren hablar? María Elena. So the second part of our talk is about roads, a road to hell that keeps coming back.
Buenos días. Quiero explicar un poco. Estamos mostrando un mapa.
We're showing them how.
Eso, el 2000.
In 2000,
El 2021.
quiero explicar eso y después vamos a. Okay, so I'm sorry, I'm confusing my experts because there's a timeline here that this map was actually created right here at the University of Richmond by my first research student in the spring of 2008, a remote sensing student who asked to do some individual research with them. And I said, well, there's this road and we're interested in finding out its history. And so he took Landsat images and he made this road of how it was expanding over time from a oil extraction road in the 80s and 90s into a logging road that was continued to work into another area. And this was actually a road that greatly impacted the community of María Elena. María Elena, ¿quieres hablar un poco de cómo esa carretera impactó a Sahuao en ese entonces, cuando en 2000, 2003, 2004?
Sí,
I asked her to talk a little bit about what it was like to have
en
a road.
esa época, el 2000, inició la comunidad, ¿no? Firmaron 5 comunidades un convenio con esa empresa forestal Venao.
5 communities signed a contract with this forestry logging outfit, Forestal Venao.
Pero eso para nosotros como comunidad Sahuao ha sido una reflexión y una experiencia malo para nosotros,
That has
¿no?
been
Como comunidad
A
Sahuao.
reflection and a very bad experience for us.
¿Por qué firmaron? Porque los líderes o la autoridad de la comunidad
The leaders
no
signed
estaban pensando hacia un futuro sostenible o asegurar un territorio ancestral que ha sido heredado por años atrás por nuestros ancestros y tener una vida tranquilo,
They
una
didn't
vida,
think about tranquil life,
tener un bosque justo para
a just
el
forest,
bien de los demás, de los niños que vienen atrás,
for the betterment of all, for the children,
para un bien de todo, la Amazonía.
for the Amazon. A ver, Rito, ¿quieres añadir un poco aquí? So this road also reached across the border into Brazil, where her cousin, Rito, lived.
Buen día. Este mapa, aquí en la foto, lo que están diciendo los hermanos de Sabeto,
saying our friends.
exactamente donde colindamos con Sabeto y el territorio de Apiucha en Brasil.
He is from the green community, Maria Elena is from the brown community. And
Y lo que
Grace is from the yellow community.
la problemática que ha traído las empresas que han hecho el contrato con esta comunidad,
You get a contract with you.
no solo ha invadido el territorio de las comunidades, como ha entrado en Brasil, como ves ahí.
They also made it Brazil.
Aquí está mi hermano, que es como agente agroforestal ambiental de la comunidad Piucha, y el ejército, y estamos ahí haciendo el monitoreo y mirando lo que pasa, los invasores dentro de nuestro territorio.
Peruvian loggers invaded our territory.
Y con eso hemos tenido una reunión entre nosotros para hacer un documento y encaminar para los gobiernos de Brasil que tomen cuenta de lo que está pasando ahí en nuestro territorio, en la sociedad.
Thus, we use it to organize to talk with the federal government of Brazil so that we could have an intervention from.
Eso fue lo que pasó a poco de lo que estaba hablando María Elena y entrado dentro de Brasil en nuestro territorio de Apiucha.
That's what happened, there, during that time. And I just want to make an aside here, is this is actually when I met, Bebito's older brother, Benki, one of his older brothers, Benki on the right, and you can see him in the photograph on the bottom left using maps to transfer that local field knowledge, which Steve did such a great job of capturing a methodology into map form, where he was able to take it to Marina Silva, who is again the environmental minister under Lula, bottom right, who's a native of Acre. She's an incredible explorer herself, and you can see familiar coronas, right, crowns and feathers. The entire community was there to interact with the federal authorities, but the map served as a vital means of communication to convince authorities of the reality of that invasion, rather than an oral history or a mental map that does not transfer quite the same way. 21.
Bien, en el 2021 está el mapa que queremos mostrar, compartir.
2021, this map shows the threat of the road opening again after having been grown over and abandoned. And the tractors were moving forward. These two tractors in particular. If anyone looks carefully, you can see a wheel behind that bush.
Oh my goodness.
And Yurúa and Alfonso.
Buenos días con todos. Solamente para dar a conocer este sucedido 2021, la empresa maderera y Prado se llama Máximo JC.
The logging company entered.
Entonces, ahí estamos, yo y actual la CUNADIS, pero ahorita estaba recién nuevo entrante para participar y respaldando la base de la comunidad de la CUNADIS. Entonces, estos comuneran comité de vigilancia, todos los directivos están ahí empezando, y yo, también mis aliados, Grupo Luz, operamos, y gracias por esos puestos para poder, hemos detenido estas dos portales.
Thanks to that forward view, been able to stop these two tractors. And you can also see Alino second from right, and kneeling, you can see Andres kneeling second from right. And raise your hand, William was the photographer. Yeah. This is quite a momentous event for this group of people in front of me.
Entonces, esta empresa Madereros y Entrados sin consulta previa por la comunidad Sao es entrada solamente he hecho he hecho un convenio aquí en Pucallpa, dos comunidades, Dorado y Shawaya, pero el Dorado no hay una necesidad de conocer sus organizaciones, porque él también va a tener una lista. Entonces, ahí se refiere al problema, el tema del daño del territorio de la comunidad Sahuaro.
So the large company had an agreement with company, I mean, a few communities, but not with Sawawo, where Maria Elena was from. And so they were trying to get to the communities that had a verbal agreement with, so they could start logging. But they did this without connecting and received free, prior, and informed consent. They just started opening up that old road. And I want to make a point to Maria Elena, había caoba sembrada ahí. There was the most valuable tree in the world. We planted along that entire old road, caoba mahogany, deliberately planted because of this opening that they wanted to reoccupy and they wanted to put the most valuable tree for future generations. Well, all those mahogany have now been destroyed. And when they reopened it through this garden, hablé un poco de caoba, disculpen. ¿Está bien?
Entonces, los comuneros de Sahuao no tenían conocimiento, pero su jefe de la comunidad ya había trato. Y justamente cuando ya había trato su jefe de Sahuao, entonces los comuneros se levantaron porque no tenían conocimiento, no tenían consulta previa a su comunero, su jefe. Entonces los comunidades levantaron a detener esa en dos forestales. Entonces, como organizaciones indígenas, estaban ahí para respaldar.
So what happened was, what they didn't realize, the community of Sawawas, their chief had an agreement with the logging company, and so the community revolted against their chief. Maria Elena was one of the community members, the president of the Vigilance Committee, who stood up and said, no, we cannot let this happen. She has strong memories of what happened before. And behind them was a Mahdish. Support them. I do want to say that we're missing one photograph here, which we will share at some point, of Maria Elena basically talking directly with the loggers on a beach, saying, Yanamas, you cannot go any further. And so this is really an incredible woman you see in front of you because she not single-handedly, she was the spearhead or the most important foundational brick of a wall that stops something damaging, not just to her community, but to all the rest of the communities behind. She is a true frontline defender. And she was backed up by the Indigenous Federation, which is not always a guarantee in any culture or federation.
Yo quiero explicar un poco el mapa ahí, la amenaza ahora.
We'll see a little bit about this map here, the page and down.
Ojo que ven hacia allá son las deforestaciones que vienen atrás de la
See
carretera.
here the deforestation and the roads that are now coming not directly to Salawo because they know they can't go there anymore. Instead, they're now threatening the headwaters above, which are land. ¿Concesiones son?
Sí, son concesiones y allá aparecen presas madereras ilegales, ¿no? Ubicado ahí en medio Sahuaro 40 y es una preocupación grande para nosotros que viene trayendo esa carretera, no
This is
solamente
really worried for us because it's affecting our headwaters along the trip.
sino varios tipos ilegales, asociaciones de traficantes de tierras,
Land trafficking.
y eso nos preocupa bastante y estamos ya, gracias con
This worries
la tecnología ahora,
thanks to the technology.
que nos apoyó, David y la institución Richamu con la elaboración de las mapas, pero con la comunidad, ¿no? Y podemos ubicar ahí las amenazas cerca dentro de nuestro territorio, sector de la frontera, tanto Brasil y tanto Perú.
We can see the threats not just to Peru, but also to Brazil.
Una área que está en verde, eso es las propuestas
The
de
area with the red
diagnóstico
outline.
de las reuniones transfronterizas que nosotros queremos proteger
Transboundary
las
meetings,
cabeceras de los ríos, de los
headwaters
ríos
of our rivers,
naciente que nace de las
where they're
cabeceras,
where the rivers
hacia
meet
Brasil,
and flow into
y
Brazil.
eso nos está afectando mucho y quisiera
This affects us a
ver
lot.
la forma como
We want to
la
see how
solución inmediato y
we can have
poder
an immediate solution
proteger esa
and how we
cabecera
can protect
naciente.
these headwaters.
En el 2023
In 2023, this year,
hemos tenido uno, pero ahora en el 2023 mismo, como 3 meses después, cómo avanzó, ven la flechita que está
you can see
dando,
the little white arrows showing how quickly, in a matter of months, it'll go to expand
de deforestación ya cerca a nuestro territorio.
near our territory, near our headwaters. ¿Quieres hablar de agricultura? No, no. ¿Quieres hablar de esto o no? I'll speak about it. You hablo o tú? Okay, I also want to bring your attention to the lower screen where you can see several clearings along in a linear fashion. Unfortunately, unlike Steve's great examples, we don't have the same sort of topography and clearings to see things clearly in the Amazon rainforest. That cloud cover and tropical forests limit our ability to see what's actually happening on the ground in many cases. But when things do happen on the ground, we can see them quite clearly if enough forest is cleared. What we're seeing here is the continuation of a road that's proceeding under the canopy, and we see agricultural plots that are happening along it. You can see that linear progression, and the information that we have from reliable sources is that almost all of that agriculture is illicit drug production, which of course brings with it a host of other ills when you think about that approaching not just the headwaters, but also the people who inhabit this region. This is another map, and forgive me, but we've been making these maps. Can everyone from AppSat raise your hand, please? No. Raise your hand. Come on. Okay, Kyle, Beth. So we've been working so hard on getting the maps as up to date as possible. Why? Because these folks are going to carry them in paper form back to the village. So we're using to creating these maps not only to share here and take them to Washington and share there, but we also are printing them out, not just to show on posters here. They're not in 3 languages for just because it's cool. They're in 3 languages so that they can actually take them back to the village and they can share them with Upper Amazon Conservancy and their partners there. And we also just want to make a note that we found out some important research from the students, such as by talking to these expert hunters, we've become aware that there's threatened species that exist within these headwaters. So there's ecological arguments for the protection of this area, in addition to all the cultural and human rights arguments that you've already heard or intuited from this presentation, such as the bald-faced wakari on the bottom left, the cacajao, apparently is present in these headwaters, and this may be one of the southernmost locations. It is the most southernmost location in the entire Juruá Valley, which is significant. I just want to talk a little poco aquí sobre Mocaf. I just want to say that we're very fortunate to have the support of Severe Amazonia and NASA and USAID and the HORP of our Conservation Amazonica, as well as Lab Gama, which is a part of the Universidade Federal do Acre, a Brazilian university, and of course our own team of brilliant students, GIS Operations Manager, Beth Zamia, Kyle Reddickton. These guys can bring it. And this group, we've been able to create not just a static map, but actually a dynamic road database of all of the Amazonian roads in the states of Loreto, Ucayali, and Madre de Dios, as well as the state of Acre, because our focus is always on transboundary dynamics. What happens in one country affects what happens in the other, right? These don't just stop at an invisible line. And so the idea being is that we're going to be able to put this data in, entonces en el futuro ustedes van a poder ver cómo están avanzando en tiempo real. So they'll be able to see how things are moving forward in real time, the roads, and so we can get everyone looking at the same data to hopefully motivate governmental and non-governmental allies to act for these elements. And we're lucky to have the Upper Amazon Conservancy, who's working so closely with these local communities, so we have a nice go-between, in addition to the power of WhatsApp. You don't have it yet. You know, you don't live a full life. Tell me about it. WhatsApp, ¿verdad? Down here, all sorts of stuff. From Elena, from Alfonso. So we just wanted to share their story. They wanted to share their story of the road. It's so important. We hope that you will take this information and think hard about roads as not just a pure good, but something that is much more complex, particularly in a state of emergency. If that road has another dry season to move forward, once you crack open the can, you can't put it back together. That's the word. Una vez que se abre la lata, ya no se puede cerrar siempre en esa carretera. Muchas gracias, Alfonso. Gracias, María Elena.
Paso aquí.
Gracias. So our last example, and I really appreciate your patience. I'm sure we're pushing all sorts of limits, but the village knows no limits. So Vito y Arlindo are going to speak quickly about climate change mapping. Because while we talk about these immediate threats, there's also a larger threat which is happening globally.
Vamos explicar aqui pouco também da importância desse trabalho, né, como o professor desde quando nós conhecemos, né, ele nos explicou e começamos a trabalhar, né, como mapa para virar nossos espaços.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of the working house, looking at the maps, new ways to think about our safety.
Então, aqui fizemos alguns trabalhos, né, em conjunto, né, dos alunos, professores, né, que produziram os mapas, né, para mostrar para nós como estava a questão do nosso espaço, a questão do clima dentro do nosso território.
So we wanted to make sure that we understood the importance of what is changing within our territory. And we thank the students for helping us understand this.
E para isso nós começamos a observar tudo o que se passa quando nós temos o nosso território e temos uma carreteira que está chegando ou passando por dentro de um território. Temos um exemplo aqui de um território catuquina.
Started thinking about what happens
que
territory outside of our territory when the road comes. Here we have the example of the Catuquina people in the Catuquina territory.
o BR passa dentro de seu território. Então, nós podemos ver tudo que está marcado fora, tudo são desmatamento, né? E só o espaço da terra indígena que está ainda contém com seus bosques.
The VR crosses, VR is like the interstate. VR interstate crosses the community right through the middle. You can see the deforestation in purple that follows the different road networks. But within this territory, it's a little different.
Então, podemos ver o aquecimento que tem, né, dentro da terra indígena, podemos observar o aquecimento que tem do lado que é onde está desflorestado, não tem mais floresta.
And we can see the difference in temperature between what is under forest, largely within the community, and what is outside forest or deforested along these road networks, where you see the higher temperature.
Então, esse trabalho dos mapas nos mostrou isso, né? Porque a gente não conseguia ver antes, né? Através de outros mapas, mas esses foram mais precisos, nos mostrou mais a realidade do que está acontecendo.
And so this map helped us see what was happening outside of the territories. And it gave us more precision as to exactly what was happening. And I'd like to make an aside right here as David that we had a workshop in 2022 and Vanessa was there from NASA and many of our students were there. We had a substitute workshop where 7 of our students were participating. But in that workshop where you saw some pictures, we did work with evapotranspiration, which is humidity. We did work with temperature. We did work with forest change. And what they had said was, we love, this is great. And we know this. We feel this. Sentimos esto en la floresta. When it's cooler, when it's hotter in the city. But we understand this. We love seeing it in a map because we can explain it better to others, right? We already know this, but now we can explain it better to others, right? But then, we want these maps of our own. And so in 2022, we didn't have that. We didn't really have that. So, en 22 no había mapas de las propias comunidades, ¿no? Solo de áreas, ¿no?
Aí mostra também pouco do que é, né, dentro do espaço, né, que tem floresta, né, e pouco também do que é o seu entorno, de tudo que se passa.
So this should be what the impact of what they call the footing, which is evapotranspiration, clouds that rise, humidity that rises out of the forest, or the forest is full and strong. And you can see the drying effects near the road network, clearly. It's something they knew, again, on side by me, but now they could visualize and share this with others. And this is a little cheer for a student who made a map. They said, thank you so much, because they had never seen, and no one had ever made a map of their territory about these topics, right? So they were so excited. They thank you, Sydney. Graduated. Okay. Consulting. Okay. This is Ethos Community.
Esse foi uma oficina, né, de acredito, de mapas, né,
This was a workshop of maps.
que foi feito na terra indígena, a Pilcha,
Workshop in my community of Pucha.
com todas as lideranças, com todos os jovens, professores, né, da comunidade, para ver o trabalho, né, temos aí outros parceiros também, meu irmão, o Benk, que tem o seu espaço também.
There's my brother, Benki, who has his own work in Europe right now. He's in the Reino Unido. Yeah, he's in the United Kingdom giving talks very similar to this. And just we just want to rapidly share this is 2003, 2022.
Mostra como que é o nosso espaço da Pilcha, o pouquinho que é desflorestado, né? É só para fazer a nossa comunidade, para fazer o nosso contato, o que a gente precisa. E o que está fora, né? O outro espaço, onde está tudo vermelho, marcado, é onde está o aquecimento, é onde é mais desmatado, né? Fora da comunidade.
This shows the small agricultural plots that we have within the community and the larger spaces outside the community that are being deforested. You can also, if you look at the deforested areas, see what the dark red shows.
Aí dá para notar, né, a diferença que tem nos mapas, né, o tempo que vai colocando, vai ficando mais diferente, né, principalmente nessa questão do aquecimento global que a gente está passando nesse momento.
And so this shows you the difference in the drying and the warming that's happening in these areas.
Como eu já tinha falado no outro momento, esse ano foi o ano mais quente que já vimos, né, na nossa região.
Most hottest dry season we've ever had in our region.
Onde teve problema não só nas plantas, mas também teve problema com os nossos peixes.
We had problems not just with our plants, but also our fish.
E ainda continua, né, seco o rio, nessa época da chuva, mas ainda continua seco, com pouca chuva e muito quente a temperatura.
And it continues even now when the rains have begun to be drier than it should be and hotter than it should be.
Buenos días.
Buenos dias.
Primeramente quiero decir a todos que estamos acá, estamos muy preocupados
First of all, I want to share with everyone here again that we are very preoccupied.
y quiero agradecerle a David y sus alumnos que hicieron las mapas en cada comunidad.
And I want to thank the David students for making maps for each community.
Bueno, quiero hablar un poco de tema cambio climático en la zona de Yurúa.
I want to talk a little bit about climate change in the Yurúa zone.
Ese soy yo y mi hermano también.
That is me and my brother.
Somos pocos líderes.
We are a few leaders.
Sabemos que muy bien el cambio climático, eso lo hace la humanidad.
We understand that climate change is something that humans cause.
Tanto como nosotros, pueblos indígenas, hacemos un poco impacto a la naturaleza.
Even though we, the indigenous peoples, make very little impact of the natural world.
Porque nosotros, comunidad, cuando es pequeño, menos impacto.
Because we, as a community, when we're small, we make less impact.
Cuando seguimos creciendo un poco más, tenemos más impacto.
When we continue growing, we have more impact.
Ahora vemos que la sequía del río, de lo que mueren los árboles, los peces.
Now we see the drying of the trees and the fish.
Nosotros sentimos muy preocupados ahora.
We are very preoccupied now.
Nosotros, como pueblos indígenas, tenemos una área
We as indigenous peoples have areas,
y necesitamos protegernos para nuestro futuro, para su futuro de los niños de cada uno de ustedes.
we need to protect ourselves for our future, but also for the future of everyone of you.
Queremos que ahora, al momento que estamos acá, yo sé que ustedes no sienten el calor mucho acá porque es muy diferente.
We want to share that we know that you might not feel the heat here because it is so different.
Nosotros en la comunidad de Yurúa, Tamaya, Monia, sentimos ahora el cambio climático más fuerte.
We now in Samaya, Ammonia, Yurúa feel the climate change strongly.
Cuando ayer hemos ido en el barco y hemos observado algunas cosas,
Yesterday, when we went in the boat on the James River, we observed some things.
y hemos visto creo que más de una cuadra de tema de quema de carbón.
We saw the burning of coal.
Sabemos que el mundo es grande, pero contaminamos ambos, tanto el bosque, tanto como los océanos.
We know that the world is large, but also that we contaminate both in the forest and the ocean.
Quiero más que todo agradecer que están acá. Necesitamos unión a la fuerza de cada uno de nosotros, seamos jóvenes, seamos pueblos indígenas, organizaciones, ONGs. Entonces, felicitarle más que todo al tema ambientales.
I want to thank everyone for being here. Right now, we need union together more than any time. Everyone, older, younger, men, women.
Creo que hemos escuchado en delante del hermano Sabieto sobre el tema de los muertes de los líderes, pero tú sabes que el Estado peruano, pueblos indígenas, casi no somos nada.
You heard about the threats to indigenous leaders and know that for the Peruvian state, as indigenous people, we are on the side.
Como decía Bebito, el pueblo indígena no tiene frontera, pero estamos juntos para protegernos, todo, sea el Estado peruano, el Estado de Estados Unidos, el Estado de todo el mundo, pero estamos protegiendo, si hablamos de la naturaleza, estamos protegiendo el pulmón del mundo.
As Vito said, for indigenous cultures, there are no borders. But there we are in the forest, protecting the forest and everything in it for everyone.
Si en caso no protegemos la Amazonía como si fuera que el mundo se acabaría.
If we don't protect the rainforest, the Amazon, the world may end.
Felicitarle a todos que están acá. Yo quisiera decirles de corazón, me gusta compartir esa experiencia y quiero más que ustedes o que nos conozcan en la realidad de la zona. Todo lo que decimos no es falso, todo lo que decimos, todo es verdad.
And I want to thank everyone here. And I want to tell you, all of you, that everything that we're saying, nothing is false. Everything is true.
Muchas gracias. Cualquier cosa que desea conversar con nosotros, estamos ya abierto la puerta, estamos para conversar. Paso.
Thanks so much. A message.
Quero dizer aqui para todos, nós que estamos presentes, para nós também que viemos lá na Amazônia, que para nós a nossa floresta é muito importante, como eu falei, não só para nós indígenas, mas como para a humanidade, para os nossos animais, para os nossos peixes, para as plantas. Todos necessitam viver. Nós indígenas vivemos na floresta com o nosso conhecimento e nós protegemos ela com todo o amor, com todo o carinho, com palavras e palavras.
We protect our knowledge.
A floresta, ela é para nós a nossa universidade.
Our forest is our university.
Na floresta está todo o conhecimento que necessitamos como povo indígena conhecer para sobreviver dentro dela.
Forest is everything that we need to survive.
É da onde sacamos o nosso alimento, a nossa medicina, da onde bebemos a água e fazemos nossas artes.
This is where we do our food,
Tudo o que precisamos.
everything we need.
Então, para nós, a floresta é muito importante para a nossa vida, a terra que nós pisamos também, da onde nós nascemos, nós vamos voltar novamente, ser terra e os nossos filhos, nossos netos vão dar a continuidade do que é a nossa história.
Forest, our land within which we stand, where we were born, we will return to once again to give nourishment to future generations.
Então, quando nós falamos, ou quando a gente ouve em algumas jornais, em algumas notícias do aquecimento global e o que a ciência fala. Nós também, como indígenas, nós estamos observando e estamos vendo o que está passando e tudo esse sistema que está mudando esse tempo.
So you were seeing how things are changing on the television, in the newspapers, but we in the forest are also sensing the changes, how things are changing.
Então, quando a gente bota a mão nesse globo aí,
So when we put our hands,
nós, vivendo na Amazônia, estamos pedindo força a todos, porque se a ciência fala do que está acontecendo, se nós indígenas falamos do que está acontecendo, do aquecimento global, e o que nós estamos fazendo para isso não ir acontecendo ou ficar mais pior do que já está.
so when we put our hands on this globe, on the earth, we're thinking about what we know, what science knows, that we know this, science knows this. What can we do before things get worse?
Então, agradeço a oportunidade de ter chegado aqui na universidade, né, através do professor aqui, David. A gente agradece e vamos voltar para a nossa comunidade, levando o que a gente aprendeu aqui também com vocês. E estamos juntos para qualquer trabalho que podemos fazer, compartilhar com vocês também. Essa é a minha percepção de mundo, de estar acompanhando o que está passando. Muito obrigado e era isso que eu queria falar. Passou.
Okay, so I just, first of all, I just want to thank the university for allowing us to come here. We have learned a lot. We hope you have learned a lot too. We are excited to have learned. We're excited to have shared. Now we're going to return to where we came from, but we hope that we will stay in touch to talk about these important things. Thank you, Asonki, gracias, obrigado. Sure, we're so out of time, it's not even funny. But what we're talking about is not funny either. And I think it deserves the time and thought that everyone has put in here. And personally, I just want to say this. It's a hard time in the forest, but when you have friends, there is future. I feel today I have more friends than I had before, and I have these friends staying in my house. As they have kept me in theirs, I feel with the students that I have the opportunity to share and learn and grow with, the colleagues I hold dear, I feel there is hope. Not much time. So let's work on it. Thank you so much.